welcome to another episode of War and Words, the webinar book discussion series by the Conflict Law Center. Today, we are so happy to have with us Dr. Happymon Jacob, who is an associate professor at the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament at JNU in New Delhi, India. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
I'm delighted to be here with you, Ayesha. Thank you so much for the invitation.
And we're here to discuss your book, which I had the pleasure of reading just a few months ago. And it is really such a great read. And I feel like I keep on bringing it up in my work. So it's been really, really useful for me. And I keep on drawing on bits from there, especially when I'm talking about, the line of control, Kashmir, UNMOGIP, the Shimla Agreement. And so to kind of start off with talking about the line of control, which is what the book is about, ceasefire violations. I really like the line on which the book ends, which is the exercise of ensuring stability in the subcontinent lies in routine and mundane measures, not in the sublime and the grandest of moves. So your book was written prior to the current ceasefire agreement of February 2021. And one of my main takeaways from the book was that ad hocism in border management is really, really not the right way to go about things. So you kind of draw a comparison between what happens at the Pakistan-India border with what happens at the China-India border along the line of actual control. And it's really interesting for me to see that there are so many protocols and agreements over the years which detail the kind of cooperation that both sides want to see, India and China, along that border. And they have so many more flag meetings compared to us, compared to the flag meetings we hold or the hotline meetings that we hold. So could you explain to me what you think, why you think that there is a reluctance in finalizing some kind of rules, moving away from ad hocism? And because, as you mentioned, even the 1960 to 61 ground rules are not yet finalized, and we're really only relying on the Karachi and Shimla agreements for any kind of codification. So why aren't we codifying these, and what would we get out of doing so?
Thank you, Ayesha, for that rather extended question, but it's a very important question. I think there seems to be a certain amount of fixation with grand gestures and grand outcomes in the India-Pakistan bilateral relationship. If you go back to 1947 onwards, the sort of conversations that India and Pakistan and their negotiators have had with each other, they were on the grander questions, right? On the question of the Indus Waters Treaty, or on the Kashmir question, Siachen, Sir Creek, etc., etc. These are, in my opinion, grander questions. There hasn't been much focus on the smaller issues, on the issues that really matter on the ground, in particular on the line of control. I think there is a fear that both in India and Pakistan, that if you speak about the smaller issues and if you put focus on conflict management, the conflict management exercises will actually overshadow conflict resolution in general. In other words, there is a fear that confidence building measures, or CBMs, will create a path dependency, and that path dependency will one day make the whole issue of conflict resolution redundant and unnecessary. I think this is the foundational, fundamental fear in some ways, and I get that fear where that is coming from. It's coming from the at least on the Pakistani side, it's coming from the argument that if we keep talking about confidence building measures, the Indians will refuse to talk about Kashmir. On the Indian side, the Indian argument would be that if we keep talking about the smaller issues, larger questions will be unaddressed, be terrorism or something else. So I think I do understand where that is coming from, but I think unfortunately this focus on the grander, larger questions is at the cost of the lives lost on the line of control, be it the lives of the combatants, be it the life of the non-combatants, the villagers, etc., etc. So there hasn't been much of a focus on the granularities of what is happening between the two sides on the borders. And so my book, in some ways, is an exercise in sort of trying to go down to the field. And as you know, I traveled with both the Indian Army and the Pakistan Army, as well as with the BSF on the Indian side. Unfortunately, not with the Pakistan Rangers on your side. Ayesha, here is a question. Can you hear me properly? Is there a lag or a problem with my video?
I can hear you perfectly.
Great. So you just have to cut this part out. That one. So unlike in the case of the India-China context, where you have not had too much of a problem for a very long time, barring of course what happened in 2020, because there is not too much of a ground level conflict happening on the India-China border. You don't have populations, for example, living on either side of the line of actual control, except in, of course, some places. But most of that is really unpopulated. What is happening on the border between India and China is pretty much isolated from the rhetoric that happens in the two countries about each other. Have a very good trading relationship with China, $125 billion. That was the trading figure last year. We don't have that kind of a let's say, mature conversation or relationship with the Pakistani side. I think that's where the real problem in some ways is. Now, sorry for digressing, but I think I would essentially come back to the argument that if we have to sort of divide up the India-Pakistan issues into two baskets. And the one basket clearly is of the big picture issues or the high table issues that of conflict resolution in many ways. The other basket, equally important, is that of conflict management, about confidence building measures, about putting standard operating procedures in place, about having more flag meetings, about having the directors general of military operations meeting once in a while. The last time the two directors general of military operations met was, I think, in 2014, if I'm not mistaken. That was like 8 years ago. So that these things need to change. So there are the two different baskets. Now, traditionally in the India-Pakistan sort of dialogue process, we looked at the first basket, the conflict resolution basket, subsuming the conflict management basket. I think it is time that we divided up the two and address them parallelly and separately. Today, as you know, we don't have the first basket at all. We only have the second basket. There is no conversation happening on the larger conflict resolution issues, only on the conflict management aspect. I can elaborate on that, Asan, when you wish me to going forward.
Yeah, and I remember, I think one of my favorite parts of the book was that lovely anecdote that you shared about the Pakistani side calling and saying, can you turn up your radio because ours is broken and we want to hear the All India Urdu radio. But I think in terms of how we go forward, and we'll come at the end, I think, to the latest ceasefire agreement, the main thesis of the book is that ceasefire violations are actually very important in that we have hyper-nationalism, we have an empowered and independent media-ish, and what happens at the border, that means doesn't really stay at the border. And so the spillover effect is spelled in escalation between India and Pakistan ties, akin to that which happens after a terrorist strike. So then if we have border rules that manage these and this escalation, what would that include? So you mentioned that some of the main reasons for ceasefire violations are defense construction and the drifting mines, which are a real issue. And now you have the presence of UAVs, you have drones there. So how should these issues be managed in a bilateral way? You also mentioned in the book that we have individual SOPs for each side, but we hardly have any joint SOPs. And also we're relying on, the Karachi agreement about defense construction. The Shimla agreement is quite silent on the line of control. So going forward, what would these rules also be?
Right, let's put it this way. I think there are two kinds of escalation between India and Pakistan. There is the intended escalation, there is the unintended escalation, right? I mean, if the two sides decide tomorrow to go to war, and I hope they don't, there is nothing that can really stop the two sides, even if you have, say, confidence building measures or standard operating procedures in place on the ground. So I am not talking about that particular basket. So
right.
There is the unintended escalation. There is the intended escalation. So should there be a terror attack, and if the Indian side decides to sort of strike back or unleash what is called the call to start doctrine, etc., all of that sort of falls in the sort of realm of the intended escalation. I am sort of coming from a very different perspective, which is unintended escalation. And my argument really in the book is that there is a lot of scope for unintended escalation between India and Pakistan on the line of control because we do not have certain rules and procedures in place. So if the two sides decide to go to war with each other, these rules and procedures and CBMs and standard operating procedures will not help at all in that kind of a situation. So that is a political decision. It will have to be dealt with at the political level. However, there are so many occasions when due to misunderstanding on the ground or miscommunication on the ground or due to lack of communication on the ground on the line of control, certain occurrences happen. For example, the line of control is not something that is delineated on the ground. This is something that exists on the map. So there can be genuine misunderstandings. There can be genuine lack of communication. So the standard operating procedures or procedures of this kind can only help in sort of alleviating situations where there are genuine misunderstandings or lack of communication. Now, there are a lot of that kind. For example, how many times have India and Pakistan gone to war with each other? There is, of course, 47, 48, there is 65, there is, 71, there is a limited war in 1999. Apart from that, every time the Indians and Pakistanis have fired at each other on the line of control, there was not a war. In the year 2019, for example, the two sides fired at each other over 5,000 times and 5,000 ceasefire violations. Now, one ceasefire violations could potentially be tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of shots in a 24-hour period in a 40 to 70 kilometer area. So you are talking about a lot of ordnance being exchanged. You're talking about a lot of fire being exchanged. A lot of that can actually be contained if there is willingness on both sides to put in mechanisms on the ground to contain some of that fire. Now, there is a political reason for firing, and there is a local, conditions which lead to firing on the line of control, right? The political reason cannot be contained again if Prime Minister Modi or President Sharif decide that Prime Minister Sharif decide that there should be something on the line of control in response to something, that will happen. That's a political decision. However, a lot of what happens on the line of control is not a political decision. It's what I call the local military factors. It's a result of the autonomous military factors or local military factors. Those autonomous or local military factors can be contained should you put in mechanisms to control that. For example, why do we need to have a long-range artillery on the line of control, close to the line of control? It should be brought back to 50 kilometers or 60 kilometers. So once you have an SOP, standard operating procedure, or an agreement that we will not deploy long-range guns on the line of control, then the possibility of firing which will lead to heavy casualties can actually be avoided. So things of that kind can actually be done. So just to sort of recap to what I said, Ayesha, so that there is no misunderstanding here, what I'm basically trying to say is there are two kinds of escalation. One is the intended escalation, the other is the unintended escalation. Having procedures on the ground can only help in the case of unintended escalation. And there are two kinds of reasons why firing takes place: political reasons and local military factors. Procedures on the ground can only take care of firing should they be a result of local military factors, not if they are a result of political factors.
Okay, yeah, no, I follow what you're saying, and I like the recommendation about long-range military weapons not being close to the LOC. And I believe that since Modi came into power, there's been an increase in their use along the LOC. I mean, not recently because we've had the ceasefire, but prior to that. And going beyond India and Pakistan, I wanted to ask as well about UNMOGIP and its role. So the UN, the United Nations Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan, UNMOGIP, India does not allow it on its territory. Only Pakistan reports ceasefire violations to UNMOGIP, and they're only allowed to visit our side of the border. And you note that with them ceasing to be a consideration after 1972, there was no looking over one shoulder. And so troops really just fired at will on the ceasefire, on the line of control. So what do you think about the future of UNMOGIP's role in the region? What should it be doing to prevent escalation and further ceasefire violations? Everything it kind of does is private, so we don't really have a look in to what they're doing and what they're reporting on and kind of what their role is. I do find that as a researcher very frustrating, because I'm like, what is this? What is the point of having an entity there from 1947 when we're not seeing any kind of product of its work?
Right. I think the answer is going to be somewhat complicated, because on the one hand, I believe that until 1971, the UNMOGIP actually did a great job between India and Pakistan on the line of control in Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, if you actually look at the history of the UNMOGIP operations in between India and Pakistan, it's quite funny that while the mandate of the UNMOGIP is to look after the ceasefire line in Jammu and Kashmir of 1948 December, during the 1950s and up to 1965 or so, the UNMOGIP actually built peace between India and Pakistan, even in the Punjab sector, because, as you know, the Radcliffe Award that was awarded by the departing British colonial rulers to India and Pakistan to divide a Punjab was not finalized on day one, right? I mean, many of the exchanges, land exchanges, continued between India and Pakistan through the 1950s up until late 1960s, actually. And a lot of this was actually mediated and negotiated by the UNMOGIP itself, although that was not part of their job, because their job was basically to focus on Jammu and Kashmir. So they actually did a great deal of job through the 1950s. In 1965, actually, after the war, the status quo ante bellum was re-established by between India and Pakistan with the help of the UNMOGIP. Now comes 1971. The war ends in 1971. The ceasefire line does not exist anymore. You have what is called the line of control. So which means the line in Kashmir changes. And because the line in Kashmir changes in 1971, the Indian side makes the argument that, hey, listen, the UNMOGIP's role was basically to monitor the line of control. But there is no line of control now. It's a ceasefire line. There is no ceasefire line now, because the ceasefire line has now been converted into line of control. So the UNMOGIP has no role to play in Jammu and Kashmir. That's a position that India has taken since 1971. And because India has taken that position, as you correctly pointed out, what you have is a situation where the Pakistani side continues to accept the UNMOGIP's presence in Jammu and Kashmir. It reports violations by India to UNMOGIP, and the UNMOGIP sends these the reports to the headquarters in New York. On the Indian side barely tolerates the UNMOGIP. It hosts the UNMOGIP on the Indian side. It doesn't report to UNMOGIP. It doesn't really care for the job of the UNMOGIP in Jammu and Kashmir. So, unfortunately, you have a situation where India has taken a rather legalistic stand that the job of the UNMOGIP has ceased to exist in 1971 because you don't have the ceasefire line anymore. Now, as a writer, I would make the argument that it is always, let's say, before 1971, there were fewer ceasefire violations. After 1971, you have a lot more ceasefire violations. Now, can you attribute this to the presence or the absence of the UNMOGIP? I'm not entirely sure. It could be the case that the UNMOGIP may be able to bring about some amount of semblance to normalcy to Jammu and Kashmir. It is also possible that the India-Pakistan relations have become so vicious that a third party will not be in a position to impose certain normalcy between India and Pakistan and Jammu and Kashmir. Either way, you cannot have a third party, unfortunately, in a conflict between nuclear-powered India and Pakistan, nuclear weapon-capable India and Pakistan, without the consent of India and Pakistan. Unfortunately, in this case, India has said that we don't recognize the work of the UNMOGIP in Jammu and Kashmir, and that in some ways ends the debate as far as this is concerned. Now, If you were to ask me hypothetically whether UNMOGIP would be in a position to bring about more normalcy to Jammu and to the line of control in Jammu and Kashmir, that's a hypothetical question. Maybe yes, maybe no. But unfortunately, we are looking at a situation where it is down to India and Pakistan to make peace. Unfortunately, we are not in a position to outsource peace building to another actor, the United Nations General Security Council or any other actor. It is up to India and Pakistan. It is up to the political dispensations and the militaries to talk about small things and make peace in a piecemeal manner. So I'll go back to my the initial point that I started with. I think the in UNMOGIP, big picture sort of a solution, as it were, right? I mean, I think personally, as a scholar, I think it is time that we went beyond our fascination for big picture solutions, of macro solutions. We should get down to the small picture of peace building between India and Pakistan, about the smaller step, about incremental steps, about CVMs, about the potential standard operating procedures between Indian Army and the Pakistan Army. I think that's where the peace will have to be built. It can't be imposed from top down.
Yeah, I think I disagree with you there, just from Pakistan's standpoint of, having a UN monitored plebiscite. That's what we're looking for, and we're looking for third-party intervention in that sense by the UN, not by anybody else. But also in terms of UNMOGIP, and I agree, there's not going to be any peace building there without India and Pakistan both coming to the table and deciding something. But in effect, it's an entirely toothless body. And so my approach would be, why is this still there if it's entirely toothless? It's not really doing anything. India is opposing liaising with it at all. And we even had the UNOHCHR report come out in 2018 and then the update in 2019. And India even responded to that and said that it was a violation of our sovereignty, even publishing a report like that. So you've had a very aggressive Indian policy against the UN, this onus on bilateralization. And I feel like what you said in the book as well really hit home to me, that they have still not asked UNMOGIP to get out. They have not gone so far as to do that because they're worried that then it would internationalize the issue. It would come up again at the Security Council. So not looking to UNMOGIP to build peace, but in a way to do something if it's still there, if it's still around.
Absolutely, you are right. I mean, the moment India tells the United Nations, listen, withdraw the UNMOGIP, it's going to open a Pandora's box. There will be all kinds of questions from all kinds of quarters. The best policy there from an Indian perspective is therefore to ignore the UNMOGIP, which is precisely what it is doing at this point of time.
And I found your, before I move on to my last question, because I don't want to take up too much of your time, I read your recent piece on minimalism, the age of minimalism between India and Pakistan and our ties, and the fact that you had a very Pakistan-obsessed BJP before they came to power. The kind of rhetoric was very anti-Pakistan, was very aggressive. And since then, Pakistan has featured nowhere in their foreign policy, and you kind of had, after a lot of overtures were made in 2016, 2015, you had Modi go to Pakistan, you had, Pathankot happen and a kind of collaborative era then, and then everything stopped with Uri in 2016. So looking at the question of how we have a current ceasefire agreement, which has lasted now since February 2021, about 21 months we've had it last, and things seem to be getting much better. We've had media reports of villagers exchanging mithai on Eid. We've had reports of villagers talking about how their lives are so much better post the shelling. We're even opening this up for tourism. So how do you think this compares to previous ceasefire agreements which have failed eventually? And what do you think the potential success of a ceasefire agreement would hinge on going forward in this age of minimalism?
Right. Thank you for asking about the recent article. I mean, I thought a lot about it before I ended up writing that article, and I asked myself, what is happening between India and Pakistan? I have been part of the I've been studying India-Pakistan relationship for almost 20 years now. I've been part of several track two dialogues between India and Pakistan. I've never seen a time when there is very little activity, or let's say very little melodrama between India and Pakistan of any kind at all. It's completely silent for some reason. There is very little activity or passion or be it firing or be it hugging each other. None of that is happening today.
Okay. Yeah.
So I asked myself, what explains this? And my answer to this is because the two establishments, I think there are several reasons behind it. One, I think the two establishments have realized that they are going to be busy elsewhere. Pakistan is busy with its own economic issues. It's busy with Afghanistan. You have other political issues happening within Pakistan. In India, we are busy with the China front, the line of actual control. We're taking to the Indo-Pacific in a big manner. We have elections coming up in 2024, lots of course, domestic elections. So the two sides are in many ways distracted by other strategic priorities, number one. Number two, and I think a lot of people disagree with me on that. Maybe you would disagree with it yourself, but my feeling is that for a very long time, India made the mistake of not reaching out to the other power center in Pakistan, right? I mean, you're talking about the political establishment in Islamabad and the military establishment in Rawalpindi. For the first time in history, you have a situation where the Indian side is directly having a conversation through the back channel with the military establishment in Pakistan. And in my personal opinion, that has actually started bearing fruits. Right. We are all complicated countries. India has its complications. You have your complications. So the art of diplomacy is about tailor-making your diplomacy to suit the needs of the situation. And until recently, until about 5 years ago, Indians said that we will only talk to the elected leadership in Pakistan or variations thereof. Today, they have overcome that hesitation, historical hesitation. I think that's a second big reason why there is a very serious dialogue mechanism, back channel dialogue mechanism that is happening between India and Pakistan, between the Indian NSA and the Pakistani military establishment, that has managed to create a certain amount of cold peace, as I call it in my article, between in India and Pakistan, particularly in Jammu and Kashmir. Now, I also caveated this description in the article by saying that conflict resolution is a more long drawn-out political process. Back channel conversations of this kind between the Pakistani military and the Indian NSA can achieve only so much. This kind of a conversation will not be in a position to resolve issues between the two sides. So at some point of time in the future, the two sides will have to come to the negotiating table again and visit some of those issues. But for the moment, do I like the cold peace between India and Pakistan? Yes, I definitely like the cold peace between India and Pakistan. Am I complaining about the lack of conflict resolution between India and Pakistan? Yes, I am complaining about that too. But I certainly prefer a cold peace to recurrence of violence in Jammu and Kashmir or on the line of control between India and Pakistan. Lives get lost, and I prefer this to that. But am I satisfied with this? No. I think there should be a conversation about outstanding issues between India and Pakistan at some point of time. Will this last? My assessment is that this probably is going to last for a considerable period of time, because you have very important stakeholders talking to each other through a certain channel. So unless and until something goes really wrong and really bad, my suspicion is that we are probably going to see some amount of let's say quasi-normalcy or cold peace, some sort of stability or holding operation, call it what you want, between India and Pakistan for the next 1 to 2 years. That's my speculation.
Okay, that's very interesting. I'm with you on all of that, actually, on feeling, that this is a better way to go about things through these back channels and through liaising with an entity that you haven't liaised with before, and also waiting with bated breath, I guess, for the bigger picture conflict resolution things to get resolved. Thank you so much for taking out the time to come and talk to us about your book. And I think that this is a really interesting discussion. I hope everyone really enjoyed this at home. And thank you, and please join us for our future episodes. Bye.
Thank you so much, Ayesha. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much.